Hello everyone, Elijah Williams with Williams Built Blades, and this is the last knife you'll ever need right here. This is a 4.5-inch blade, very similar handle design to, actually the same as the little Scout knife that I make. Blade is an inch longer, so this is a 4.5-inch blade. Little Scout's 3.5-inch. And this particular one is 440C stainless steel, and the thickness is about 150 thousandths, which is slightly thicker than an 1/8 inch. And I sort of say that tongue-in-cheek, last knife you ever need, but I do firmly believe that if you have the right skills, this knife will do 99% of what you need to get done out in the wilderness with a cutting tool, until you need to move up to a hatchet or an axe or a saw or what have you. And that kind of segues me into the main point of this video. That's a prototype that I'm working on, so you'll see it out eventually here. Bushcraft, it's become really commercialized in the last decade or so. When I was growing up, I learned in practice what I called primitive wilderness living skills. Yeah, it's probably not an original term, but that's me thinking of everything after everybody else. But the point was that because I was really fascinated by the idea that if you could take a good blade like the Native Americans or the Indians and walk into the wilderness and have the skills to make everything you needed with the resources at hand to live comfortably, not just survive but actually live. That was really fascinating to me, and that was sort of the whole thrust of my self-education in practice of those skills. So to me, that's really the essence of bushcraft, and like I say, it's become pretty commercialized in the last years or so. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because a lot more people have become interested in it, and that's good, because if you don't have people involved in something, then it's got a potential to kind of die out. But one of the things that I think has happened is that, especially for people who are new to it, they start, get on the blogs and the forums and in these bushcraft stores and stuff like that, and they feel like they have to spend a certain amount of money to get a certain knife or a certain hatchet or a certain pack or whatever in order to truly be practicing bushcraft and get the most out of it, which I don't think is true. Personally, when I was growing up, I had a buck knife or something cheap, and a book bag backpack, and just a tin can is what I had for cooking out of and that kind of stuff. And it was good because it was great. I didn't know any different, but also you're not relying on this expensive gear, or gear that you can only get from a certain place. So that aspect was good too. But so along the same lines is when somebody goes to buy a bushcraft knife or a knife they want to use for that, sometimes they kind of have that mindset where, I have to buy this knife, it's this much money, and to get a good bushcraft knife. Well, I'll be the first to tell you that's not true. And you don't have to buy a custom knife to get a good bushcraft knife. And you're probably wondering why I would say that, because that's what I'm trying to do, is sell custom knives, most of which are geared sort of towards bushcraft. But the reason is I'm not here to sell something to somebody they don't want, and I want everybody to make an educated, informed purchase, not just because somebody on some online forum says you need this knife. There's a lot of knives out there for a really reasonable price that'll do the job just fine for most people. If somebody wants a blade that's been built from scratch, every part of the process is done by hand, by me, with care into each part of that process, then you buy a custom knife, and that's what I'm here to provide. So don't think that you have to buy something that somebody says you need to buy, or it has to be a particular thing. You should do enough research and education for yourself to understand what a good bushcraft blade is. And personally, based on my experience, this is the closest that I've seen. And yes, I designed it, and no, it is not a revolutionary design. It looks very similar to a lot of other knives out there. So yeah, people who have experience along these things are going to come up with some similar conclusions. But so don't think you have to spend a ton of money and get something just because somebody says you need to. A basic blade, I like the flat grind. This is what this has. A basic blade with a flat grind, you know, between 3 and 5 inches and a comfortable handle. That would be my basis to steer somebody in the right direction. And you don't want too thick of a blade either. The thicker the blade, the less cutting clearance you have. And you shouldn't be beating rocks on the back of your knife, so you probably don't need a 1/4 inch thick blade at that blade length. Just a thought. So along these lines, I've actually run into a few things from some customers and potential customers that I'd like to address as far as custom bushcraft knives. Like I said, there's a lot of information out there. Not all of this information is accurate or correct, and especially if you're new to it, excuse me, you read something online and it seems to make sense. If you don't know any better, then you know, why wouldn't you believe it? And so there's not these people that are out there trying to be ignorant or anything like that, but there's been a few things that have sort of routinely popped up that I've seen online and also experienced personally. One of them is that your bushcraft blade needs to be a high carbon steel like 1095 or 1084 or Owen tool steel, which is a high carbon tool steel, which is very similar to 1095. And there's several reasons for that, but that's not true. It doesn't have to be that kind of steel. One of the reasons that people think that it needs to be that kind of steel is that some people think you can't strike a ferrocerium rod effectively with like the back of your knife unless it's a high carbon steel. That's not true. You can use a stainless steel knife, the back of a stainless steel knife. You can even use a hacksaw blade, even like a sharp piece of glass. Basically anything that's going to scrape off some of that ferrocerium rod and create a spark. So that should not be a deciding factor in the kind of knife or the type of knife steel that you buy. And incidentally, most ferrocerium rods that you buy from a store come with a little striker that's metal. It's not very hard metal, and it gets the job done just fine. Another thing is that some people want a high carbon steel blade so they can use, in case of emergency, their knife as the striker in a flint and steel setup. First of all, that's not what a knife is made to do. You should practice your fire building skills with other fire building tools and other skills like a bow and drill, for example, which can be very effective with the right practice and under the right circumstances. But there's a bigger problem with this. A striker for a flint and steel setup is generally high carbon steel and it's hardened and tempered to a specific hardness. If it's too soft, it won't strike a spark effectively, because what actually happens is that flint shaves off a little piece of that steel, and with the carbon in that steel, science happens and it creates a spark. But like I say, if the steel is too soft, it's not going to work effectively. So it has to be a pretty good hardness. Now, I haven't done a double blind study on this. I am not a flint and steel expert. However, I did do a quick and I think fairly telling little experiment. I found this rock some time ago. I don't know exactly what it is. It's some kind of flint or flint-like rock. I'm not a geologist, so that's the best I can do. I have a piece of 01 tool steel. It's 1/8 of an inch thick. This particular stock I use for like the Luxor river skinner and that kind of thing. Same exact steel that I use for the Little Scout blade and other knives. This piece of steel has been hardened. It is very hard comparatively. It has not been tempered. It will not make a good knife blade. It is far too brittle. And that was this particular piece of steel I was using to check a heat treat process, and that's why it's snapped off in an angle like this, and I was checking the grain structure. The grain structure is good, but it's too hard to make a good knife blade. If this were tempered to take some of the hardness out, it would make a great knife blade. This is a former Little Scout blade. Okay, this is also 01 tool steel. It has been hardened and tempered. The only thing that, before I did a stress test on it, would need to have been done on this was put a handle on it and do the finish, or do the finish polish and then put a handle on it, and it would be ready to go as a usable knife. it has been heat treated for that purpose. And it passed the stress test okay, but you're not supposed to put your knives into a vise and bend them over all the way. They tend to snap off sometimes. So this is a knife, and this is a piece of steel that's too hard to be a knife. So I was able to do a quick little study on this. Whoa. And I found that I could get sparks quite easily with this hard piece of Owen high carbon steel. And then I tried the steel that was heat treated to be a knife, and I have not yet been able to get any sparks off of this. It's too soft. So long story short, if you heat treat your knife to this, it will snap off far easier than this did. You won't be able to sharpen it. You won't be able to do any kind of torquing on it to speak of. Long story short, it will make a really crappy knife blade. So just maybe this is just anecdotal, but if you want your knife blade to be a striker and a flint and steel setup, I'm not going to make it that way. I'm going to make a knife to be a knife, and in my maybe limited experience, it doesn't make a good striker. So I don't know where that originated from online or wherever it originated from, but that's not a good rule of thumb to go by. So if you want a good bushcraft blade, you need to think about not just the kind of steel, because what's more important is how it's heat treated, like you saw there. Those two steels are the same steel, but just in that little experiment, very different characteristics of what they could do. Obviously your knife needs to be able to hold an edge, but it also needs to be tough enough so that that edge at the microscopic level can hold up, and that's where toughness is. And so hardness versus toughness, that's why we harden and then temper. Okay, so that's what makes a good blade, and probably not a good flint striker. So one of the reasons that a lot of people like the carbon steels is the aesthetic properties of them. They're not stainless, and so with proper care they can develop what's called a patina, and it's going to be sort of a soft gray to multicolored finish on the blade, and with proper care and regular use and that kind of thing, you get that developed, and it looks pretty good. So a lot of guys like that. It kind of has to do with the sort of the traditional aspect of the bushcraft stuff. 100 years ago they didn't have all these fancy stainless steels, and so guys want to use this more traditional tool, which I get. I'm on board with that. That's fine. Another reason that you would use high carbon steel or get a high carbon steel blade instead of a stainless steel is affordability. Because steels like 1095 and 01 tool steel, they're good steels. There's nothing wrong with them. I dare say that most people using a blade out in the woods or wherever, when it comes to edge holding capability and just general cutting ability, which is what a knife is for, they're not going to notice a huge difference between the carbon steels and the stainless steels. Now, I realize there's some stainless steels out there that can hold an edge forever and that kind of stuff, but then how easy are they to sharpen and that kind of thing. So when it comes to cost versus use, I would dare say that most people would notice a big enough difference to where they would feel like they got a really good deal with that that expensive stainless steel, and that's going to depend on the person too. But that's another reason you would get a high carbon steel blade, is the affordability, which you can spend a lot more for a stainless steel blade. You're not necessarily going to see an exponential rise in benefit. So there's that, and that kind of brings me to the end of this video here. But if you have any questions about any of the stuff I talked about, anything about custom knives or bushcraft knives or survival skills or whatever, feel free to contact me, Facebook, email, here on YouTube. I don't check everything regular. I check my email regularly. YouTube not quite as much, but just shoot me a message, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. If I don't know the answer to something, I'll do my best to figure it out and find out for you. So that's kind of the gist. So, and last but not least, I do want to talk to everybody that's watching this video. Obviously, maybe you're at a point in your life where you're experiencing something that's really tough, and you've come to the end of yourself. A lot of us have experienced something like that, and I just want you to think about the fact that you were created by a good and just God. And if you're experiencing something in your life that's really difficult, and your life is tough, and you're wondering where to turn to, this could be your time to stop and think about that. I can tell you from personal experience and from experience of many other people that you will not find peace in this life or the next unless you get right and get in a right relationship with your Creator. Every one of us was created by God. Every one of us has done something or done many things to separate us from relationship with our Creator. That's the bad news. The good news is that not only is God just, He is also a loving God, and He sent His Son, Christ Jesus, to die to pay the ultimate price for my sin and for your sin and everybody else's sin who is willing to accept that sacrifice and believe on Him as their Lord and Savior. That is the only way that you can and will get in right relationship with your Creator. And if you have any questions about that, I would be more than happy to answer them. Maybe there's just one person that's watching this that needs to hear this. And if that's the case, then that's perfect. So with that, stay tuned for more videos, and take care.